Let's look at John 5. All right. Now, last time we ended with the two-level drama that J. Lewis Martin had proposed was active in John 9. What is the two-level drama? What does he mean by that?
Two things happening simultaneously.
Are they happening simultaneously?
Well, they're one happened before, and then kind of the same thing is happening at a later time.
Right. So they're not happening simultaneously, but they're being told simultaneously. So you're right. There is an important simultaneous act here. On the one hand, you have the Ein Malig, one level, which is the once upon a time level, the in the past.
Say that. How do you say that?
Ein Malig.
Ein Malig.
Mm-hmm. One time is literally it's German for that. And so you have the Jesus level of what happened, one time. And then you also have a similar occurrence happening in the Johannine community as Jesus manifests through a Johannine preacher. Okay, so just as when Jesus walked the earth back in his day, he healed a blind man, so a Johannine preacher, Jesus manifests through him and heals a blind man in the Johannine community's day. All right, now, what is it that leads Martin to suggest this? Well, first he has some form critical observations. Miracle stories are typically told for what purpose? Glorify God or glorify the person doing the miracle, right? So what do we normally care about the person being healed? We don't. Once they have testified, oh, I've been healed, great, thank you. Please exit to stage left and pick up some lovely parting prizes that we have for you. But what's curious about the passage in John 9?
It's reversed.
Yeah, we do the healing, and then Jesus leaves, and then suddenly you have this influx of new characters. The neighbors start showing up and saying, well, who is this guy? It can't be the same guy. It must be his twin. He keeps saying, no, it's me. And so then they host this big inquisition. They go question his parents, and what do the parents say?
He's old enough.
Yeah, that's our son, but he's of age. You talk to him. You got questions. We don't know anything.
He's not
right?
a twin. It is he.
Yeah. And why does the text say the parents said that?
Because they were afraid to get put out.
Yeah, they were afraid they were going to be put out of the synagogue. And Martin says, well, that's rather curious. Because do we know of things kind of reaching that level during Jesus' day? No, there was never a threat to kick people out of the synagogue in Jesus' day because they were following him. Right? There were, Rabbi Akiva famously thought that Bar Kokhba, who led a revolt, not the one in 70, but one a couple decades later, he thought he was the Messiah. So thinking someone was the Messiah was not an expellable offense in Judaism. All right, as we saw at the beginning of the semester, there were lots of messiahs, or claiming to be messiahs, who arose, and people would follow them, and then they would come to nothing, and so you wait for the next one. Which is why when Jesus showed up, they're a bit reticent to embrace him with open up the leadership anyway.
Well, were any of these early messiahs, were they as authoritarian or spoke with the authority that Jesus did? Or were they just looking like, okay, here's some prophecies, I'm going to say I fulfilled them, now follow?
It depends on what you mean by they spoke with authority.
Well, like at age 12, he's in the synagogue teaching and preaching, and then he goes...
That's actually a common trope in the ancient world. So Josephus claims the same thing. He was, little genius. And was far beyond all his peers and amazing everybody from a young age. So we get a lot of those kind of stories from the ancient world. We have other stories of divine births, not in Judaism, but in Greco-Roman circles. I think Ehrman starts, or you'll see in a chapter yet to come, where he tells one of these stories. So in many ways, the gospel stories are picking up on kind of common forms of stories that are told. Now, it does say repeatedly in the Gospels, people were amazed by his authority. Okay? Which is worth thinking about. When was the last time you were amazed by someone's authority? I mean, that's not something usually that you find amazing. So what does that mean that they were amazed by his authority? Okay. But yeah, you would have other people who raised up and were very sure about what they were saying. So sure that they were able to lead people, to go out to the wilderness or go, sit and watch for the walls of Jerusalem to fall down and all of that kind of stuff. Believing God had anointed them to, raise people up at that hour and all of that. Which again is why when Jesus shows up and starts, overturning tables in the temple and screaming about, you've turned this into a cave of insurrection, the chief priests and leaders are like, we got to shut this guy up. We've seen this movie before. We know how it ends. We know how this is going to play out, and it doesn't end well. Right? Remember the Egyptian that the the guards thought Paul was in Acts. We read his story earlier in the semester, where he led people out. And again, it's this Exodus imagery kind of, revivified. And, I'm from Egypt, and God has told me, come out, we'll watch the walls fall down. And then the Romans go out and kill them, by the hundreds. So there were other prophets in Judaism. Again, as we talked about before, this idea that you have John the Baptist or you have Malachi, and then this great famine of God's word. No prophet raised up until John the Baptist suddenly starts crying. Not true. John Hyrcanus was a recognized prophet. Remember, Josephus talks about him having the three things, the government of his country, the priesthood, and the gift of prophecy. There were also other miracle workers. There were people who were known as miracle workers. Is Jesus unique enough to make everybody say, "Oh, wow, this must be the Son of God"? Well, there's something about him, right? And it turns out in his case, all the stuff he said was true. Whereas these other people tend to have been mistaken or, misled or whatnot. But there are enough similarities between Jesus and other people who had arisen that you can understand why the leadership was like, oh, here we go again. Does that make sense?
Some of the sorcerers and the magicians were able to do some of the same things.
Seemingly, yes. Yeah, just like when Moses shows up in the Exodus and he says, oh, look what I can do. And the sorcerers say, yeah, we can do that too. Right? And so for the first few rounds of this I can instill a plague. Well, we can too. The difference was Moses could actually end it. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I think his spirit was stronger, I would suggest. In the same way that Peter and Paul, by the time they reach maturity, it's enough to have Peter's shadow fall on you, and you can be healed. He doesn't have to touch you because his spirit is now exuding out of his physical space. So again, there was something I would suggest unique about Jesus, and he was able to draw crowds and inspire people, and people could hear God's voice in him.
And like the light that he's supposed to be, kind of reminds me of like a light bulb that bugs are attracted to.
Yes. But again, and remember, it's who is it that tends to not recognize him? Those who are looking and those who were educated. Right? And we see the same kind of thing today. We think, oh, if I'd been back there, it'd be so easy to discern that this Jesus guy was God in the flesh. It's not. It's not. And again, it's the people who are most eager to please God that are liable to miss what he does next.
It's very interesting that I think tonight or last night, they had a 2-part series on Jim Jones. And he claimed to be the Messiah, and 900 people lost their lives.
Yeah.
And so, how easy are we led astray?
Right, and we don't want that to happen, and so we become very skeptical about anyone who claims, that kind of authority or insight. And yet, God's going to be giving, certain people those levels of authority and insight, and when they come along, they say, well, yeah, I saw that with Jim Jones. This person can't possibly. How do we discern? How do we discern? And that's actually going to become a crucial issue in the Johannine community. Because who is their ultimate authority? Well, within the not the Johannine community is called such because it seems to be the community that produced the Gospel of John, not because they are adherents of John the Baptist. But if you've read through John and you've read through 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, what is their ultimate authority? Who is the key teacher in the Johannine community? It's not. He's recognized as an elder. He's respected for that, but he's not the ultimate authority. Who's the ultimate authority? It's the Spirit. It's the Spirit. Which works great as long as everybody's hearing the same thing. But what happens when I start hearing one thing and you start hearing something else? Right? What happens when I hear Donald Trump and you hear Hillary Clinton? Right? The election in 2016, do you know what the leading determiner of whether you were going to vote for Hillary or Trump was? At least among whites.
You were college educated.
College educated versus church. If you had more education than church, you tended to vote Hillary. If you had more church than education, you tended to vote Trump. Right? That's true. Yeah. Which, if you notice, are the same two categories that had people screaming at each other in Matthew 11. Those who had revelation and those who were educated and wise. And why did you need revelation to discern? Because it went against the current wisdom and offended their sense of holiness.
That's
You
why
said
they call it
you said among whites.
Mm-hmm.
That was the opposite.
Yep, African Americans largely voted Democrat.
Yeah, but for the
Right.
opposite reasons that you just said.
Well, it could be, yeah. But the African Americans largely broke Democratic. But among whites, the leading predictor of which way someone was going to vote was whether they had more education than church or more church than education. 538 had an interesting, that's the Nate Silver polling thing. Right? So my point, though, is it's not easy to discern. And we have to learn how to discern. Right? Because there's so many other things that can influence what we think we're hearing. Right? And you've got to get to the point where you can hear what God is telling you, even when all the other people around you are saying, no, God doesn't tell us to do that kind of thing. Or he doesn't tell us to support those kind of people or to stand with those kind of people, whoever those kind of people are in our community. Because there's going to come a time where God calls you to do exactly that. He's going to call you to take a step of faith where, like with Martin Luther, they say, you stand there and that's it, you're out. You are dead to us. You are cut off. Right? And again, that's the wilderness trial. That's the wilderness trial. And the temptation, especially as you're out there and you're waiting and nothing's happening and it's not seeming to go well, and the temptation to say, you know what, I must have been wrong. I got to come back over here. And inevitably, as soon as you do that, the glory comes. But if you're not there, then you don't go. You're not going to be commissioned. You're not going to be sent out. Right? I mean, think about the disciples after the crucifixion. That's pretty low. Right? I mean, did we miss this? What, it wasn't supposed to end this way. I really thought this guy was the one. But I guess not. And then he shows up and spends either a few hours or 40 days, depending on whether we're looking at the end of Luke or Acts. But then he does what again? He leaves. He leaves and says, wait. Just wait. Okay. And so they're waiting. And what has changed? It doesn't seem like much. And again, there's got to be a temptation as the days turn into a week. Forget this. Now I'm going to go back to Galilee and start fishing again. Because why not? I mean, that's what I know. But if you do that, then when the Spirit came, they wouldn't have been there and they wouldn't have received the empowering that they needed. Right? So it is always hardest to discern what God is doing when you are in the midst of it. Right? It's always easier for those who come later to look back in hindsight and say, yeah, God was on that side. But when you're in the midst, it's not so clear. It's not so clear. Does that make sense? All right. So, back to the two-level drama. Martin suggests that this is like two projectors playing on one screen. And so, first you have these odd form critical observations that the story seems to kick off right when you think it should be winding down. And then secondly, there are all these issues raised that don't seem pertinent to Jesus' day. This threat of people being kicked out of the synagogue because they support Jesus. Or this pitting of Jesus against Moses. Right? No one in Jesus' day was holding Jesus up to the level of Moses and pitting the two against one another. That comes later. Does that make sense? And so Martin says this is rather curious. Because here we have a story purportedly from Jesus' day, but these are later issues. And that's why he suggests what's going on is the author has merged these two stories in a way that invites you to draw the comparisons and see the relevance for your own time. So again, I mentioned back in 2016 when we were going through Matthew 11, and one side saying we played the flute for you and you didn't dance. Well, we sang the dirge and you didn't mourn, right? Well, you're crooked and nasty. Well, you're a racist and a bigot. Well, wait a minute, those weren't terms that people were hurling back and forth at each other back in Jesus' day. Where do those terms come from? Today, right? The political, and again, in 2016, it was immediately apparent because those were the terms that were all over the place. So why did I do that? Because it's not historically accurate. As a way of helping people to see the relevance for their own day. Does that make sense? And that seems to be what John is doing here, telling the story of Jesus. And again, Martin would want to say that both of these things actually happened, but it's just the details are being merged. Right? So Jesus actually heals somebody in his day. And in the Johannine, Jesus actually heals again through a Johannine preacher, someone in their day. But all this stuff about the Inquisition and who healed him and all that, that's mainly from the Johannine community day. Does that make sense? All right. So what about John 5? The healing at Bethesda. Says, after these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porticos. In these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered. All right, could someone read John 5:4?
For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring up the water, stepped in was made well from whatever disease with which he was afflicted.
Taekwon, you look a little puzzled.
I don't see it, John 4.
Yeah, where is John 5:4? I bet in several of your Bibles it's not there.
I have a better Bible. Y'all better start reading what I read.
Right? If you want to have fun with your congregation, ask everybody to turn to John 5:4. Wait a minute, it's missing. Yeah. If you notice, at the end of verse 3, there's a little bracket right before waiting for the moving of the waters. And it goes all the way through the end of verse 4. What does that mean? It means we don't think this was originally in the text. And so a lot of Bibles are just going to go ahead and take it out. Some of them put it down a footnote.
What about Bible?
Right. They took it out because it doesn't seem to be original. It seems to be something that was added later.
And it's funny you said it because whenever I open my Bible, I go straight to the NLT. That's one of my favorite translations. That's not in there what you just said. Like,
Yeah.
The bracket part.
Right. Everything in the brackets is judged by scholars to be a secondary edition that comes after the fact, and so it is taken out.
Which is why he wanted us to read the NASB.
Well, it just depends on which version, how the editors chose to do it for that particular one. Yep.
But like you study this stuff and going back and trying to dig and find out what all this stuff means, really, it's kind of crazy.
Seek the chaos.
Well, I'm just saying, I can get in, but I can't get in because I'm too old. I can't never get in because I can't get down there. I mean, it's just kind of.
But you're here. You're in.
I just asked the question.
Yeah. Yep.
All right, so how do you I don't, maybe defend is not the right word, but where you have one of your congregants will quote, "Oh, nothing is to be added or taken away from the Word of God." You're just saying now that, oh, this is added in, so.
That's why they took it out.
Right. So where are we stand on this? How do we read it? Do we say, well, let's just trash the NASB or trash the NLT?
No, well,
Do we go to all of King James? Jesus spoke common English.
Right. Well, if you want to see it, if you look at, flip over to the end of John 7, the beginning of John 8. What do you notice there? Yeah, this the story of the woman caught in adultery, right? Where they bring her before Jesus, and say, "What should we do to this woman? She was caught in adultery." And Jesus, bends down and starts writing something in the dirt, and then says, "Well, let the one who's without sin throw the first stone," and they all kind of leave. That's also likely a secondary addition. It's not in our earliest manuscripts of John. When it does appear, it appears in multiple different places. It even appears once in Luke. You got to go all the way to 8:11.
Let's say a footnote.
That whole story. This one they tend to leave in because it's a story everybody knows, and if you suddenly lose 11, 12 verses, people are going to say, wait a minute, what's wrong? So they can just put big brackets around it, but they tend to leave that one in. The smaller one, the little segments of verses or verses like in 5:4, oftentimes they'll just go ahead and take it out. And again, it's because from a text-critical standpoint, the evidence suggests it's not original to the text.
So somebody just like randomly made up this story. And they were like,
Well, someone thought this was a story that should be in there for some reason. But again, when it does get inserted, it gets inserted at different places, which would suggest it wasn't there originally, and so there wasn't a tradition as to where it belonged. Like Gordon Fee, who was one of my professors, he was a text critic. He would say, the story of the adulterous woman, did Jesus do that? Probably. It sounds like Jesus. It sounds like something he would do. Is it scripture? No. Would I preach from it? No, because it's not scripture.
Do scholars have an idea of the year maybe in which some of these were added?
No, you can't. Yeah.
So I was wondering about what he wrote on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's quite possible that it's an accurate story that had been handed down, but it was not originally part of John. And then this gets into the question too. Well, when is it published? Because we're going to talk about later. John seems to have gone through several revisions. Acts seems to have been put out in 2 different versions. And they're not major differences between it, but there's a lot of stuff added. A few words here, a few words there in the other version. Almost as if someone went through and revised it, adding little things. So something to be aware of. Something to be aware of. When you see little footnotes that say some MS or some MSS, some manuscripts read, what it's talking about is different textual traditions. Okay? All right, so back to John 5. A certain man was there who had been 38 years in his sickness. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been a long time in that condition, he said to him, "Do you wish to get well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Arise, take up your pallet and walk." And immediately the man became well and took up his pallet and began to walk. Now it was the Sabbath on that day. Therefore the Jews were saying to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not permissible for you to carry your pallet." But he answered them, "He who made me well was the one who said to me, 'Take up your pallet and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your pallet and walk'?" But he who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. Afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "Behold, you have become well. Do not sin any more, so that nothing worse may befall you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But he answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." For this cause, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he not only was breaking the Sabbath, but also was calling God his own Father and making himself equal with God. All right? How do you think Martin is going to understand this passage?
I have a question.
Yep.
I just want to ask you, I was going through this stuff like you took my secret chaos. Jesus asking somebody, "Do you wish to get well?" That kind of like just caught my attention. It's the only place in the Bible that Jesus asked somebody, "Do you wish to get well?" And then the man had been out there all the time. Of course he wished to get well because of the fact that he was waiting for somebody to trouble all the time.
Well, so why does Jesus ask that question? It's a good place to start.
I'm just saying, that was me.
Yeah, no, that's a great place to start. Why does Jesus ask that question?
It's got to have tone. It's got to be like a tone where he's presenting himself. Kind of like somebody asks with a pizza. "You ready to eat?" Of course I am. Here I am.
Right?
He asked that blind man, "What can I do for you?" Jesus sees somebody
Yep.
on fire. You put water.
And what's curious? What does the guy say?
I have no man to put me in when the water's trouble.
Yeah, he doesn't actually say, yes, I want to get well.
Right.
He says, I don't have anybody to put me in the water. Right?
So Jesus could do that. Is that kind of his inclination here? He's like, you ready?
Yeah, well, I can help you, sir.
I look at
Take my arm.
I look at it as he's asking, this is a rhetorical question of those that are in authority over Israel. Do you want to see? Do you want to be healed? Do you want to see the glory that is before you? And they're like, well, I just don't have anybody who's going to pick me up and do this for me. So,
What if it's a legitimate question? Why would Jesus?
no, it's in the New Testament. It's not a legitimate question.
Right, well, but I mean, it's I mean, not just a pro forma kind of, well, I got to get your permission before I come into your house kind of thing.
It's because he,
Why might he not want to be healed?
it's not going to
Mess up his disability payments.
Okay, so yeah, this is what's often suggested that well, if I get well, then I'm going to have to start working, and people aren't going to give me money anymore, and I'm going. I mean, we have that problem today, right? Once you get on welfare, it's actually a disincentive to start working because you start working and your welfare check goes, right? And so you're now doing more work but getting the same amount of money, and well, who wants to do that? Yeah, this is all he's known for 38 years, right? And so that's an awfully big change to suddenly come. So that's possible. Your life is going to change if I do this. Is that what you really want, or are you content to just continue on? And oftentimes, frankly, we're content to. I mean, we say, of course, oh yeah, I want to be healed. Why doesn't God ever heal me? But do you really want that? Well,
Have you ever seen the life of Brian?
parts of it.
Where he's like, alms for a former leper?
Yeah.
Former leper? Well, this guy healed me and I was a former leper. Well, go get a job. No, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little sacrilegious.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the issue. Once you're healed, things change. What else is going to change? Do you wish to get well?
He's going to have to not do what he's been doing.
So lifestyle changes are probably going to happen, but what else is going to happen? Yeah, in the Bible, not Life of Brian. In essence, Jesus is saying, I can heal you, but that'll have consequences. And what are those consequences going to entail? We talked about some of them. Your lifestyle is going to have to change because people can.
People start getting on it.
If
If I heal you, what's going to happen? People are going to start associating you with me.
And that was another question that got to me because you went to 9 before you went to 5. And then after you did 9, you come back to 5. And this time in 5 it says sin no more. But in 9 it said we're talking about sin. And like
Okay, good. Yeah, we'll come back to that in just a second because that's another good point. But just to finish this up, if Jesus heals him, I mean, think about what happened to the guy in chapter 9.
He had this inquisition on him.
Yeah, I can heal you, but then you're going to be associated with me. And if you get associated with me, what's going to happen? Yeah, and more than just people looking at you funny, the authorities are going to come down on you. Are you ready for that? I mean, it's not just about you can't beg anymore because you'll be healed and have 2 good legs. But once you're associated with me, that pulls in a whole bunch of other consequences. Do you want that? Well, I've been here and no one's helping me into the pool. And
So once you accept Jesus' spirit, that's kind of saying that just people look at you differently.
yeah, and again, and as we saw, what happens immediately? The authorities come and say, hey, you're working on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to carry your pallet. Hey, the guy who healed me told me to do it. All right, who was it? I don't know. I don't see him. He didn't give me his name. Right? And then Jesus finds him later, and then as Jesse pointed out, what does he tell him? Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you. Now, what does he mean here?
He's contaminating lives. That causes him to be alive.
Okay, is it possible for him to now sin no more? So what does Jesus mean when he tells him, don't sin anymore, otherwise, something worse might happen to you?
Don't sin on purpose.
Okay.
Like don't do it on the really.
Yeah.
You were only a 50% sinner, now you're 75%.
Yeah.
Is it because it'll confuse the way he has to do work? He doesn't want people to feel this,
Well, Martin suggests there's a very specific sin that Jesus has in mind right here. You've been made well. Now, as you said, don't contaminate that with sin, lest something worse happen to you. What sin could he be referring to? Well, I'll give you a hint. What does the guy immediately go do? Oh, I found him! I found him! It's that guy! It's him! He's the one that told me to do it! Right? And what Martin suggests is this is a warning, don't turn on me. I've healed you. Now you're associated with me. Don't turn on me or else, it'll be even worse for you. Right?
Turn on him as being proclaiming him?
As in turn against him. Right? And again, think about the contrast between this guy and the guy in chapter 9. What happens to the guy in chapter 9 when the authorities come? So why are you asking me about him? Do you want to be his disciple too? Right? I don't know. That guy made me see. What have you ever done for me? If I got to choose between the two of you, I'm throwing my lot in with him. Right? And later he finds Jesus and Jesus says, you believe in the Son of Man? Tell me who he is so I can believe in him. Well, you're talking to him. Yeah. I believe. Right? What about this guy? Hey, I was just doing it. He made me do it. He's the one you want. Go arrest him, not me.
So this is almost a Judas revamp of pointing out who did it, who it was. Judas came and met Jesus with a kiss. Even though everybody knew, oh, well, yeah, Jesus is all around, and I've got to point him out. This guy is saying, he's the one that did that.
Yeah. Yeah. He turns on Jesus. Right? And so, again, like in Hebrews, those who have tasted of the powers of the age to come and then fall away, there's no hope for them to be brought back. Which I would suggest is referring to those who have entered into their promised land and been, empowered from on high. It's not talking about anybody that ever changes their mind about Jesus and then wants to repent. It's not talking about that. It's talking about those who've been through their wilderness, persevered through the difficult, dark night of the soul, and made it out on the other side and were empowered and glorified and all of that, entrusted with the powers of the age to come, and then turn on Jesus and reject him and well, in that case, they've thrown it all away. It seems to be that kind of thing here. I've made you well. Now don't put yourself in a worse situation by turning on me now. Which is exactly what the guy then goes and does. All right, does that make sense? And then we get, in verse 18, for this reason, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. And how many reasons does he give?
3. Breaking the Sabbath, calling himself God, and making himself equal.
Okay, and the last two are kind of grouped together, right? Calling God his Father and making himself equal to God. Now, how do you think Martin's going to interpret that? How many of those were issues in Jesus' day?
12. But,
Were they?
see, guys, come on, I'm breaking. Come on.
Yeah, breaking Sabbath, right? You read the synoptics and everybody's like, oh, why are you breaking the Sabbath? Why are your disciples breaking that? Why are they, plucking grain and doing all that? What about this calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God? That's the charge. But do we see that in like the synoptics? No. So again, Martin's suggestion, not only was he breaking the Sabbath, that's the Einmalig level, the Jesus Day level. Making himself equal with God, that's the Johannine Community Day.
What about when they're crucifying and say, if you are God, if you are the Son of God,
If you are the Son of God,
come down. Take yourself off the cross. Is that not part of making himself equal or calling himself God? In the synoptics?
not necessarily.
Okay.
And again, as we'll see, what seems to be the big issue in the Johannine community? I mean, what does the Gospel of John portray Jesus as? I mean, again, he is divine from the, he just exudes divinity. His humanity almost gets swallowed completely up. Right?
From a historical point of view, a lot of rulers and kings claim to be gods. So
Right.
That's still a common concept.
Right.
This time,
Right. And in fact, Caesar would soon declare himself to be God, and you had these cults that were worshiping Caesar. But this isn't really an issue until later, when Christians start ascribing Jesus as God. Right? And that's what's going to be the big tension point with because the Johannine community seems to have originated in the synagogue. But as they started to come to the realization that Jesus was actually God, their fellow brothers and sisters who were Jews started to think, wait a minute, you're crossing some lines here that we can't cross.
Well, it was like disciples of Moses versus disciples of Jesus.
Right. Right. Jesus starts taking on a more and more exalted status until eventually you get the point where he's God.
So at that point, the disciples of Moses are like, you guys aren't the Jews anymore.
Exactly.
You're your own religion now.
Exactly. If you're going there, you're no longer part of us, you're out. Right? And we'll see this when we kind of look at how the gospel was shaped and all of that.
I don't mean to bother you. I was reading through this stuff. This stuff is getting to be kind of tough. I just want to say this, and I'll be through for the rest of this. I was reading. No, I'm serious. It started off with Jesus, the Word became flesh, and all this stuff. And it goes on down, and then you start to read, and you keep on reading, and all of a sudden, they get to a wedding, and the mother of Jesus, and all this stuff. Well, then, where did she come from in John? I mean, I'm just saying, the Word, all this stuff. It's just stuff going through my brain. I'm clear for the day. Thank you very much.
Well, and Jesse, you hit on the two verses that were on the screen, right? You picked out the two key verses.
Wait a minute, Jesse, you got to take my.
I think I tell you I was
Right? Because those are exactly the ones to question. What's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, the Word became flesh.
Yep.
Where? Among them. Now his mother said, go down there and do what he said. No, I'm just saying, in the gospel, they talk about Jesus being born, they talk about all this other stuff. But when we get to John, we're going to get over there all of a sudden. They're going to wear that his mother said.
God claims
Yep.
to be the Word in the Old Testament, right?
I'm just saying, but John.
Well, you have the word that is coming to people and seemingly interacting with them. And again, Judaism, in the Boyarin article that's on Canvas that you should have access to now. You don't have to read it, but it's there for you if you want. He kind of charts how Judaism was going in that direction, kind of recognizing the Word as being an entity that was God but was also distinct from God, and kind of a second person of the Godhead. All right. So does the two-level drama make sense? How Martin suggests that you have these two episodes that are being projected onto the same screen. And actually, as we'll see, he's kind of doing this with Jesus too. Because the Jesus walking through John looks a lot more like the resurrected Jesus than the pre-resurrection Jesus.
And couldn't just how often he goes from north to south, north to south, north to west, back to south, be the reflection of the two-level drama? That's what I was picking up on when I was going over my
Possibly. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. All right? Does that make sense? Okay. All right, we can go back and review the notes and listen to the tape. All right, so part 2. John has a lot of Son of Man sayings, 13. So we'll look at a few of those.
And this is a silly question, but the author of John is not John the Baptist, right? It's
Correct.
people from the Johannine community.
Johannine community. Yeah, we'll talk more about that in a few minutes.
My dad asked me that last night, and I was like, my dad, I really don't even know. I'm not.
Yeah, it's not John the Baptist. It's not John the Baptist.
You wrote the post.
You'd be surprised how many people get that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Well, everybody's named John, so.
Like the Gospel of Mark was written by John.
Yes. Also not John the Baptist. All right, so you might remember at the beginning of the gospel, Nathanael, Jesus comes and Nathanael's a little skeptical. Hey, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Jesus says, well, hey, before I saw you sitting under the fig tree. And suddenly Nathanael is blown away because this guy clearly has spiritual sight and says, oh, okay, I'm willing to follow you. And Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. All right, now ascending and descending is a motif that we're going to see several times associated with the Son of Man in John. Do you know there's an allusion to the Old Testament here? Do you know what it is? Jacob's ladder. Good. Genesis 28, 12 to 17, verse 12. Jacob had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Right? And in Hebrew, that could also be on him. All right? So what is Jesus implying here?
That he has Old Testament roots.
It goes beyond that.
Okay.
He is the ladder. He is the connection between heaven and earth.
That's cool.
Right? And note, Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, Bethel. And this is the gate of heaven. Right? Who's playing the role of Jacob in the New Testament in this passage? Nathanael. Right? Surely this is God, and I didn't recognize it. Because he said he saw me under the fig tree. Right? Does that make sense? So in the same way that Jacob, when he sees the ladder, is suddenly awakened to the presence of God in this place in a way that he was not aware of previously, so Nathanael, when Jesus says, reveals himself, is struck that he's suddenly in the presence of God in a way that he didn't realize.
And would Nathaniel be aware of the saying in Genesis and sort of find that like as a clever connection?
Probably. Okay. All right. The next one. No one has ascended into heaven except the one who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. So again, you get this ascending and descending motif. Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. All right, lifting up is another one of these motifs that we're going to see associated with the Son of Man. Now, this is also referencing an Old Testament episode. Which one? Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness.
Passover.
It's not Passover.
Exodus.
It is during the Exodus. And what happens?
It's confronting Pharaoh.
The people spoke against Moses, or against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? We had it so good back there, and you ruined it. Then the Lord sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, we have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord to take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, make a poisonous serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live. So Moses made a serpent of bronze and put it upon a pole, and whenever a serpent bit someone, that person would look at the serpent of bronze and live. All right?
Therefore, the symbol medical symbol,
The caduceus,
caduceus.
which actually seems related to something else, but yeah.
Probably fertility or something.
I think it's Asclepius. All right. So what does it mean to lift up the Son of Man?
To be what is our focus.
Okay, what does lift up mean? To raise. It can also mean exalt, right? So you have to lift up the Son of Man. If you didn't have it in this context, what would you think that means? Let's lift up the Son. Let's lift up Jesus. I mean, have you ever heard somebody say that in a church service? What do they mean? They're not talking about, physically, putting him on a higher place. They're talking about, let's lift him up. Let's lift up our praises. Exalt him. And again, John has lots of word plays going on. Right?
It's also being lifted up in reference to the crucifixion.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Just as the serpent was lifted up, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. What is the point of his ultimate exaltation in John? Well, you have a merging of lifting ups. Right? There is the earthly one where he is lifted up on the cross. But then there's also the exaltation to his heavenly spot sitting at the right hand of the Father. And so you get this kind of two-level drama going on. Right? There are two lifting ups. Which is also a play on this idea of exalting someone. Now, why a serpent? Seems like an odd choice to. Well, because what are the serpents?
Serpents are evil.
They're evil. I mean, you can all the way go back to the serpent in the garden. And here they're poisonous serpents. They're the ones whose bite brings death. And yet that's what you're supposed to lift up. Why is Jesus comparing himself to a serpent?
Well, the pharaohs, which he called brood vipers.
Pharisees? Not pharaohs.
Pharisees. Those that were in control that he called a brood of vipers were the ones who killed him.
Okay, yeah, you're right. You're right. He's killed by what he calls a brood of vipers. We saw that, the connection in Luke and Acts where Paul then is struck by a viper.
So, through being killed by them, and then Moses makes a symbol of the serpent, he lifted up.
Except, who is the Son of Man parallel to in this comparison? Yeah, the serpent. The serpent. It's not someone bit by the serpent, it's the serpent itself. Why is Jesus comparing himself to a serpent?
Because Moses makes a poisonous serpent, puts it on the pole, and that heals people.
He's going to feed them.
Right. So how does he do that? When he is put on the cross, Right, we've talked about this a little bit. What is his status under the law? Under Jewish law, he's hanged on a tree. According to Galatians 3:13, he's accursed. Because Deuteronomy pronounces a curse on anyone who's hanged on a tree. Which means that any Jew who embraces him is what? Cursed. Right? And actually what Paul says God is now calling for the Jews to do is to transgress the law and rejoin the nations. Well, what happens when you transgress the law? Yeah, it brings curse or death. Right?
So then actually what Justin was saying that to them.
So, and this is why the cross is a scandal in Judaism. Right? Because to embrace it is to embrace death as a means to life. Just like the serpents that were the cause of death become the means of life. Things get twisted and flipped. We saw that in Matthew 2, right? Oh, we thought that was a blessing, but it turned out to be about, bad thing. And then at the end, it takes the opposite kind of flip, right? When they say, his blood be on us and our children. Meaning we accept guilt for this. You don't worry about it. We'll take the heat. But what are they doing? They're calling for the ultimate redeeming blood to be on them and on their children. Which I would suggest is a word of hope for the Jewish people from Matthew. Right? So here again, you have a symbol that traditionally represents evil and death suddenly becoming the means to life. Which, if you think about it, is what has happened to the cross as well. Right? Even for us. I mean, it's an instrument of torture and death. And yet, it has become a symbol of hope and life.
Plus it makes us a target.
Well, there's that aspect of it too. Right? You've got to embrace the death to see life on the other side.
There's two tap healing black.
Right. Right. Okay? So, exalting the Son of Man. John 8:28. So Jesus said, when you have lifted up the Son of Man. Oh, by the way, back here. No one has ascended into heaven except the one who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. What's curious about that?
Oh, I circled that when I was reading.
Mm-hmm.
He's speaking about himself in third person.
He is.
Okay.
But what's curious about that?
Come on, BJ, you had
Come. I just like why if you're him, why are you speaking? Why are you calling yourself he? You would just say I.
Right, yeah. He seems often, even in the synoptics, to use Son of Man kind of as a substitute for I. Right?
But he's already placing himself in heaven eternally with God because he can't come down unless he's already been up.
Right. No one has ascended into heaven except the one who descended from heaven. So what's the order of operations there? What comes first? The descent.
Yeah.
And then the ascent.
Now it's taking us back.
Say that
What?
loud. Say that loud.
Came from heaven and he's going back.
Does it say he's going to ascend?
He has.
He has ascended. Well, what is that talking about? Because in the context of John's gospel, we're still at the beginning. We're in John 3. He just came.
In the beginning.
He was always in.
Okay, but it says he had to descend so that he could ascend. And this does seem to be, kind of taking a swipe at, say, Moses, who was rumored to have ascended into heaven to receive the Torah. Right? No one has ascended into heaven except the one who descended from heaven. Well, who's the one that descended from heaven? He is, right?
So he's saying he's God.
Well, he's saying he came from heaven, but he hasn't ascended yet at this point in John. Right? Does that make sense? And so again, this seems to be a projection of the resurrected Jesus back onto the earthly Jesus. This kind of two-level drama again, such that the Jesus that's portrayed in John is often viewed through the lens of the resurrected Jesus, as if he's already been resurrected as he walks around, and that's why he's so divine.
But that makes sense.
Why would he do this?
All that. Since he can see the future, past, present, it makes
Right, and the idea is because for this to be true to the course, Jesus would have to have descended to be born and then had some kind of ascent and then come back. But John hasn't mentioned anything about that.
But we know it happens. And you're saying that this is a combination of that.
Possibly, but yeah, I would suggest a better way to make sense of this is to again see that John is playing the resurrected Jesus over the earthly Jesus, in the same way that he was playing the Johannine community over the Jesus' day. It's again this two-level drama, both being projected on the screen. And so the Jesus that we see in John is often the resurrected Jesus being projected back onto the earthly Jesus in all of his glory.
I feel like they get you back grade in a writing class. They're like, what are you doing? You know? Confusing me. Isn't it?
So this is like he's using this as like instead of starting in the middle, I think of Star Wars. How they started in the middle, and then they
Went back.
Yeah. So this is Jesus is descended. He's walking, but now he was there. He will go back once he comes down.
So again, in John, the perspective isn't always from the time that you're reading about.
Okay.
So like
In the same way that in John 5 and John 9, he's bringing in issues from later, here he's bringing in a later perspective as well, a post-ascension perspective. Right? But he's putting it in the mouth of the earthly Jesus. Mark's had it. He's out.
Is it sort of like taking a scene from an older Star Wars movie and a scene from a later one and combining it into one story itself, or one little scene? A
Yeah.
combination of the two?
Yeah.
They don't do that. Going along with Star Wars quote.
All right. So, exalting the Son of Man. So Jesus said, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will realize that I am He, and that I do nothing on my own, but I speak these things as the Father instructed me." All right. Well, again, what does it mean to lift up the Son of Man? Well, yeah, you would think to glorify Him, to praise Him. But it also has this secondary meaning in John. When is He ultimately lifted up? Yeah, on the cross. That's His point of exaltation. That's His glory. When you lift up the Son of Man, then you'll realize that I am He. And I do nothing on my own, but speak these things as the Father instructed me. Note then, 12:23, and in 12 we get this shift. Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." Yeah, put to death. That is His glory. So we pray, Lord, let your glory fall. We want to be glorified.
Last stop of that amazing journey.
Yeah. Right? "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." He said this to indicate the kind of death He was to die. Right? Now again, that side of crucifixion, when you hear this, "When I'm lifted up from the earth, I'll draw all people to myself," how many of you think, he's talking about His death? Right? He again is speaking things beyond what they can know. He knows they're not going to understand it, because there are things that you just can't understand that side of death and resurrection. The crowd answered, "We have heard from the law that the Messiah remains forever. How can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man?" Okay? Now, when is he lifted up from the earth? Well, there is the lifting up on the cross. But again, there's also the subsequent lifting up to his place in heaven. And the two are kind of being merged. Does that make sense? When does he draw all people to himself? Well, from the cross, but also from his position in heaven.
So
Right? When he is finally exalted into heaven.
it's like the two-level drama, sort of an ancient genre of writing that he's purposely trying to fit it in with.
Nope. Nope. This is just the brilliance of the Johannine theology. All right? All right, now, the farewell discourse. This is John 14, 15, and 16. He says, "Do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way where I am going." Now, where is he getting ready to go? Is he getting ready to go to heaven? Mark has no idea where he is going, but he knows it's not
He's
that.
going to Jerusalem.
Well, they're in Jerusalem, right? This is
He's going to Canaan. He's going back up north.
He's going to make one of those quick trips up to the Sea of Galilee and back.
I gotta go check on my timeshare.
Yeah. It sounds like he's getting ready to go to heaven, doesn't it? But where is he getting ready to go? This is at the Last Supper. He's getting ready to go to the cross. He's getting ready to go die. But this sounds an awful lot like he's getting ready to go ascend into heaven. Right? And so again, we get this kind of juxtaposition of departures and returns. Right? So on the one hand, death is a departure. Right? He's going to die on the cross within 24 hours. And the disciples are going to be hit with an absence. And then resurrection comes. He returns. Right? But what happens after that? There's an ascension. He goes away. Followed by what? An absence to be followed by a return. Parousia. Parousia. That's typically the word typically used of his second coming, of his return. Okay, the parousia.
We're waiting on that?
Hmm?
Or we're waiting on that, or is this
What he seems to be doing is drawing a connection between the absence in death and resurrection, hey, I did come back, and what we are currently experiencing as the absence between ascension and parousia when he returns.
Okay, that makes sense.
Does that make sense? So again, we're juxtaposing, these two things. So he's getting ready to go to death, where he'll be absent and then he'll be resurrected, but he speaks as if he's getting ready to be ascended. After which he'll be absent for a time because he's preparing, place, and then he's going to return. Right? Does that make sense?
And in the absence, he tells his disciples what to do, how to do it. And in his absence now, since ascension, he's telling us what to do, how to do it,
Right.
to bring about the kingdom of God.
And how many wars we went to?
Right. Well, and he has three ways of comforting the disciples while he's absent. Okay? The first way is the coming of the Son. Okay? I will not leave you as orphans, I will come to you. All right? And again in chapter 16, a little while and you will no longer behold me, and again a little while and you will see me. Here I am. Right? Yeah, so he will come to them while he's seemingly absent. Right? The second way is, did you have a question?
Yeah, someone wanted me to ask.
Asking for a friend. They just texted me.
Where does it come from when they say that Jesus descends into hell?
1 Peter 3, and that's probably not what it's talking about, which is why the Methodists stripped that out of the Apostles' Creed.
Yes, doesn't matter if we don't believe in hell.
Okay. He said 1 Peter 3.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right texture.
I would.
I was like, ass.
Yeah, like 3:17-22, 1 Peter. Where it talks about him being made alive in the Spirit, in which he also went and made proclamation to the spirits who were disobedient in the days of Noah. And that's often been understood as a descent into hell, where he goes and takes the keys and preaches the gospel to what it's probably the spirits there are probably not human spirits. Then you would expect soul. He would go preach to the souls. The spirits are angelic type beings, and it's the ones who were disobedient in the days of Noah. And so this is probably William Dalton argues, I think rightly, that this is not a descent into hell, but on his ascent, as he passes through the second heaven, it's a victory proclamation over those angels who had been disobedient, and it's I won, you've lost.
Is this also where the Catholic Church can say, through this, we will pray your loved ones out of purgatory as long as your check cashes?
I'm not sure where that comes from. Yeah, it's hard to kind of find a biblical justification for that. But there is a sense of the saints who've gone before appearing and are, you notice there's a lot of legal terminology and judicial imagery that's used in the Bible. At one point, I think in Ezekiel, God says, if Noah or Daniel or one of these paragons of righteousness were to appear before me, I still wouldn't listen to them. And so there seems to be a sense in which saints can argue on our behalf, and saying that Jesus is our advocate in heaven. He's our ultimate advocate. But there are court systems in heaven. There are courts. In charismatic circles today, one of the latest trends is going into the courts of heaven to present your case, get verdicts, and then come back and see those lived out. None of which has anything to do with the farewell discourse. All right. So the second way that he says he's going to comfort the disciples while Jesus is absent is through the indwelling of the Father and the Son. Okay? Jesus answered and said to him, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him." Right? So note, up here, I'm going to make a place for you because there are many rooms in my Father's house. But then we come to make...
We're going to come live with you.
Yeah. The rooms then shift, and suddenly they're coming to live with us, in us. Right? And then third, he says, I'm going to send the Spirit. I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, that he may be with you forever. That is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it does not see him or know him. But you know him because he abides with you and will be in you. Okay. Now again, this all seems to relate a lot more to the ascension, absence, parousia time than the death, 3 days, resurrection time. All right? So what is the role of the Spirit? Well, he says, "But the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I said to you." Remember last week we looked at several passages where it says they didn't understand at the time, but later they remembered that Jesus had said these things. Well, what does it mean they remembered? Well, that should be the little, flashing lights, ding, 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 ding. What's going on here? The Spirit is bringing to their remembrance all that Jesus said. and explaining, here's actually what he meant.
I think that's the work in our modern day too. We find
Mhm.
revelations in certain things. The Holy Spirit going about it.
Right. And so, as we'll see, well, he then goes on. I have many more things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. But when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all the truth, for he will not speak on his own initiative, but whatever he hears, he will speak, and he will disclose to you what is to come. He will glorify me, for he will take of mine and will disclose it to you. All things that the Father has are mine, therefore I said that he takes of mine and will disclose it to you. All right? So, again, who is the supreme teacher in the Johannine community?
Spirit.
The Holy Spirit. Right? The Holy Spirit is to come and teach each one of us. Which, again, is great as long as we're all hearing the same thing. But, and as we'll see as we go on, the Johannine community ends up splitting. Because they disagree over what they hear the Spirit saying. And so, this question, how do you discern? How do you know if it's really the Spirit? And not some other spirit, or not your soul, or not just wishful thinking. Yes. That's exactly what Jesus said. All right? Okay? Again, this is one of those passages. They did not understand at the first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered. Right? Ding, 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 Spirit at work. Spirit at work, reminding them, oh yeah, that stuff happened. We did that to him. We just didn't realize what was going on at the time. Right?
That donkey's coat is the only time Jesus is ever riding something of transportation. You imagine just
Yeah. He was very fit.
Wow.
Yes.
You want to get kicked by Jesus.
All right? Yeah. That's exactly the lesson to take from that project. Yeah. All right. Now, in John 20, Jesus said, have you believed because you have seen me? And who's he talking to here? Thomas, right? Because Thomas said, I'm not going to believe until I put my hand on his nail marks. And blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Why are those who have not seen blessed?
Taking it on faith. And that makes God happy.
And why is that a blessing?
Something that's sowed in
Because
the
Jesus
heart.
is not present with everybody every day. He's already back in heaven, so we have to take on faith.
Okay, and why is that a blessing? Because as we've already said, contemporaneity with events raises the temptation to see only with the eyes of the flesh. When you're in the midst of it, it's really hard to discern where God is. Because people on both sides or all sides are claiming God's inspiration for why they're holding the positions they're holding.
I'm actually experiencing it, so it must be the right way that it is.
Right. Right? Those who come later are not only not disadvantaged, they are in some ways at a greater advantage. Right? We weren't there in the room. But in some ways, that gives us greater clarity. Right? We're not confused about, well, was he really raised? Well, okay, some today are still confused about that. But you can see the fruit and which side God was on. Right? And that is an advantage because you can see in ways that you can't see when you're in the midst of it. Or it's more difficult to see when you're in the midst of it.
It's like the settled water in hindsight.
Yes. Yeah, hindsight's 20/20. All right, does that make sense? Which then leads to this question, is John history or theology?
Yes.
Exactly.
Told you. Bam!
Exactly.
You said it so precise, didn't you?
I had heard that one before. I had a 50-50 shot.
Edwin Hoskins. The evangelist is persuaded that the meaning which he has heard does veritably lie in the history. Without it, the history is meaningless. Take away the meaning, and we should have merely the record of an eyewitness. Take away the history, and we should be left only with the human notion or idea. Right? So yes, John is interpreting what he is, it's not necessarily what you would have seen with the video camera. He's giving you the post-resurrection perspective on things. But that's because he's giving you the fuller significance to what was really going on. Right? If you didn't have that, all you'd have is the video recording, which leaves a lot to ambiguity, as we just said. But if it's not actually grounded in history, then it's just some great idea that he happened to have. You've got to have both. Does that make sense? And as we said last time, John for a long time, John was kind of put to the side in terms of historical research. Like, well, that's clearly theology. But it's now being rehabilitated, and scholars are coming to recognize more and more there's actually a lot of good history in John.
Some of my favorite preachers preach out of John. Timothy Keller, it seems like all he preaches out of.
Mm-hmm. Right? In other words, Hosking goes on, to opt for either history on the one hand or theology on the other in reading this gospel is totally to misconstrue the intentions of the evangelist. Because you have to see both together. You have to see what happened, but you have to see the spiritual significance at the same time. And that's what he's giving.
It's like he's taking history, presenting it as a real-time flow of events to paint that picture, to paint the theological picture.
Yes. Yeah, and so he's giving you the theological insight as to what was going on, which is why he's portraying Jesus as the resurrected Jesus throughout the gospel. Right? It's not that you would have seen that if you had the video camera, but he's giving you the significance of what was happening. The glory that was shielded from us.
That's what we as pastors or evangelists or speakers of the word, we have to look at the context of the scripture, of who it was told to, when it was told to, the history, but then also the spirit of what was said, the theology.
That's difficult to understand.
And we can't cherry pick. I mean, we can cherry pick. It happens all the time to make it fit our agenda. But if we're true, we have to take the good with bad.
Yeah, and what it means is you can't surrender the history. Right? You can't say, well, this happened, it doesn't really matter. I mean, no, it does matter. It does matter whether these things really happen. Right?
Ask that about that same question about the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, in the next couple of weeks, we'll look at the historical Jesus and kind of the questions that come up there, why they come up, what we do with them. But the point is, don't surrender the historicity of things. Right?
I think it makes it more beautiful. I mean, to be able to find actual archaeological sites and stuff like that, that relate to these. I mean, that's all the more evidence for somebody that wants evidence.
Yeah, again, flesh and spirit have to testify together. Revelation and word have to testify together. If you're hearing one thing from one and something else from another, you do not yet understand.
And you're still in the wilderness.
You're still what?
In the wilderness.
Yes. Yeah. You do not yet understand. You've got to see how the two come together. Now, in the meantime, you've got to, make your best guess as to, what's accurate and what's not, and where you got to, while you're wrestling with it. But don't surrender the wrestling. Don't surrender the text. Don't.
So this is why there was a split in the Johannine.
We're going to get to that. Yeah.
Does one come before the other?
Not necessarily. The process can start at any one. Yeah. It can come from your experience, right? Your experience could lead you to think that something that you read in here doesn't sound quite right, and so you start questioning it and seeking greater insight. Because ultimately, these things all have to testify together, right? Yeah, I mean, there is truth in the Wesley Quadrilateral.
Now, for the Jews, it's not tagged.
Yeah. Was there a question?
Come on, Jessica.
hard to understand it in the right context. It takes a lot of energy to do it. You can't surface level this thing.
Yeah, and again, the key, as John makes perfectly clear, you got to develop the relationship and learn to hear the Spirit. The Spirit can make it easy. He knows all things. He can tell you whatever it is that you need to know. But you got to get to the point where you can hear Him.
So, you know, back to the not seeing yet believing.
Yes.
part, it's kind of, I'm just gonna say not fair kind of thing. You know, that you are in the midst of something that, say, God has you in the midst of. Yet someone on the outside can be given more insight. Maybe they're not given it, but it seems like they're given more insight than you, who are trying to receive.
Mm-hmm.
So it just like, it seems like it's not fair.
That's often the way it works. And why? Because it then forces you to come together.
It's like in sports, you got the announcer and then you got the player, they interview the player afterwards. You watch the game, you hear the announcer's perspective, you hear what the player saw in real time. The mind and
Yeah. Well, and it's like on a lot of these political issues that are being debated today. A lot of times people are just talking past one another. And they don't hear what the other side is saying at all because they're only hearing it through their own lens. Right? When in truth, people on both sides often have good reasons for supporting the positions that they do. Right? Now, one side may prefer mercy, one may prefer justice. And the question then is, how do we bring them together? And that's what we've got to see how to do. But in order to do that, we've got to start by respecting and honoring what God is doing in those who are standing on the other side. To say that those, for example, who support the Second Amendment, favor killing children, that's just ridiculous. That's not why they are holding to the Second Amendment, right? And on the other side, to say that those who are in favor of more restrictive gun control, they just want to take away our liberty. No, they're concerned about life, right? And until we can acknowledge that, okay, you both have legitimate reasons for holding your positions. Now let's see how we can come together and try to find a solution that addresses all of these things.
Then it gets convoluted when they say, well, you want your guns to kill the children, but I want to have the ability to have an abortion to kill a child. And you're like, wait a minute, we're not coming together.
Right, and it becomes about, well, I got to discredit you so that my position can win the day.
If you don't agree with me, you're a bigot, or homophobe, or whatever.
Exactly. And take another example, the Make America Great Again. Right? African Americans hear that very differently than Caucasians do. Right? But it doesn't mean that those who are saying it are racist. Right? But they're not meaning what you're hearing. Because your experiences have conditioned you to hear it a certain way, and that's completely understandable. But to then turn it around and say, well, they're racist, or if someone says that they are an America First or a nationalist, then they're therefore a white nationalist who just wants, a white nation again. That's not what they're saying. But again, because we're hearing everything through our own experiences, which we all do, right? And that's why we've got to learn to start listening to what others are actually saying and coming together in conversation so that we can come together and move forward.
And it's the same thing with the Black movement. The kids, about the
Black Lives Matter?
Whites hear it different than
Exactly.
what we're trying to say.
Exactly. Black Lives Matter mean, the number of blacks who are being killed, especially by police, is disproportionate, and it needs to. We need to do something about this issue. Whites here is you're saying white lives don't matter, right? One of my favorite clips. There was it was the. Trying to think of the name. It was a big Trump rally in D.C. MOAR, the mother of all rallies. That was it, MOAR, mother of all rallies. And And so some Black Lives Matter activists from New York drove up, and they were going to go protest, and they had their chains and their fists raised. And the people on stage said, "You know what? I see we got some Black Lives Matter people here." And it was like, "Boo!" And I said, "But you know what? We're about free speech. So I'm going to invite you to come up here on the stage. You can say whatever you want to say. You get 2 minutes. We may agree with you. We may not. It doesn't matter. We are about free speech, and you have a right to say your piece." Right? And so the guy goes up on stage. And he starts, talking and saying, we're not against police. We're against bad police. In the same way that you're against bad politicians and bad, corrupt people, those people need to go out. And as he talked and people listened, by the end, they were all able to sing, I think it was God Bless America or something together. Right? Because when you actually listen to what the other side, you realize we all want the same things.
We want to make America great. This is how
Right. And the way he ended is, if we make America great, we do it together. And he is exactly right. And afterwards he said, I had bikers coming up wanting to take, pictures with their grandson and me and, wanting to shake my hand. And because when we actually listen to what one another are saying, instead of being so quick to, try to defend our position and prove why we're right and we've got the better side, then we can see how to come together and move forward.
I think we should do, when we use the word is listen, and if we could just put a speaker up here and have everybody else's mouth taped, and let that person talk.
Yeah, and again, try to hear it from their perspective instead of through our lens. Right? Because our lens, just like when Paul went to Athens and started talking about Jesus and resurrection, they said, he's preaching different deities. No, he wasn't. But that was their lens, shaped by their experience, and so they heard it as he's speaking about two different deities. Right? We do the same thing, and that's why we've got to come together with those who are different from us, who have different experiences than we do. Because they're going to see and hear things differently than we do.
We being in this class prove that.
Yes. Yes.
Us being at this seminary.
Yeah, that is one of the greatest strengths of Hood Theological Seminary, is the diversity that you have and the opportunity to interact with those who are different from you, not only racially, but denominationally, socioeconomically. That is a great blessing. Take advantage of it. Take advantage, and don't let those relationships stop once you leave here. Right? Find ways to continue those relationships. Find ways to integrate your churches. I mean, it's not that every church has to be 50-50 black-white or third and a third Hispanic or it's not that you have to. But we've got to find ways to appreciate what God is doing in the other community. Because he's doing something there that we need. Right? He's doing something in our community that they need.
Playing the flute, singing the
Exactly. Exactly. There's truth on both sides. But until you see how they fit together, you both misunderstood. And it turns it into a falsehood. Does that make sense? I would say, too, that is this country's calling. To model a kind of e pluribus unum, out of many, one, which is the same thing as the body of Christ. That's why the enemy is trying so hard to keep us divided. Because our call, if we can overcome all the sins and things that we have in our past and come together as a model for the world, then there's no stopping us. Right? Right? The truth will set you free. That's why America has a very important destiny. And it's time for us to start walking in it, and that's why you're seeing all of this junk come up. Because in order for us to walk together and come together is what we've got to deal with all the junk. In order to deal with it, you can't just keep putting Band-Aids over it. You got to actually deal with it. And that's why it's ugly when it comes up. It's ugly. And it's painful because, you know, those wounds are painful. Right? But God is preparing this country, and he's allowing this stuff to come to the surface and come out so we can actually deal with it, so we can begin to start walking in what he's actually created and called this country to be. Does that make sense?
That's gonna be on the
2020. Speak to Bishop.
All right, back to John. The structure of John. We have the introduction, which is John 1. Then, as Bultmann says, the revelation of the word to the world, 2 to 12, is kind of his public ministry. You get the 6 signs. It's been suggested this was maybe a signs source. Maybe that was kind of the origin of the gospel, was this source that talks about the 6 signs. Then at 13 to 20, you get the glorification of the word for the world. So first the revelation, then the glorification. Here you've got the passion. Jesus, knowing that his hour had come. Okay, and we've seen this throughout the gospel as early as John 2:4 when she says, hey, help them out with their wine problem. He says, hey, my hour has not yet come. Right? John 7:30, they were seeking to seize him, but they couldn't because his hour had not yet come. 8:20, he spoke these words in the treasury. No one seized him because his hour had not yet come. Jesus answered them saying, finally, John 12, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Now my soul has become troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I came to this hour. Right? And again, hear the contrast with the Synoptic Gospels. When he's in the garden, you know, let this cup pass from me. What am I going to pray? Save me from this. No, this is the whole reason I came. Right? But notice, what is his hour? What is his moment of glory? Yeah. You know, we pray for God, you know, God, let my hour come. I want to be glorified. What does that mean? The hour when you die. Maybe physically, maybe just, you know, spiritually, but you will go through a death experience. But it will have benefit not just for you, but for those who will then come after you. Right? John 13:1. Now before the feast of Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own, he loved them to the end. Jesus spoke these things, lifting up his eyes to heaven. He said, Father, the hour has come. Right? And note, he knows when the hour has come. He's able to discern it. Okay, now is the time. Now is the time. All right? Here you get the private ministry to the disciples, the farewell discourse, the Last Supper, the foot washing, all of those things. Farewell discourse, the trial, crucifixion, and resurrection. And then we get the epilogue in John 21. All right? Let's see that outline in Stephen Smalley. There are also several Johannine aporias, or gaps, things that don't seem to fit. For example, I will not speak much more with you, for the ruler of the world is coming. He has nothing in me, but so that the world may know that I love the Father, I do exactly as the Father commanded me. Get up, let us go from here. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples. All right, do you see what's odd about that? Well, what's odd is that this doesn't come until 18, and this is the end of chapter 14. Right? I can't speak anymore with you because the hour's here. We got to go. Come on, let's get up. But let me give you 3 more chapters worth of stuff.
Preacher said, in closing, let me give you.
Right, and 3 hours later, he finally ends. Right? So what's going on here? This is kind of awkward. I can't say anything else because we got to go. But actually, now that I think about it, I'm the vine. You are the branches. Let's develop that a little bit.
Is that more than 2 level surfacing?
No, this is just a gap, an aporia. We're going to see several of these. John 20, therefore many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Right? Wraps up the gospel well, nice summary statement of his purpose for writing and sums it all up. What's the problem? We then have another chapter, right? Which concludes, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. There are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written.
A lot of books.
So he just said the same thing, just a little bit different.
Yeah. Now look at this passage in 21 for a minute. This is where Jesus reinstates Peter. And if you look at verse 22, 21. Peter, therefore, seeing him, said to Jesus, this is after he's reinstated him the 3 times. Let's start at verse 20. Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back on his breast at the supper and said, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? Peter, therefore, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, and what about this man? Because that's the question we all want to ask, right? Okay, enough about me. What about him? Is he going to get to go further than I do? Because that's not fair. Jesus said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. This saying therefore went out among the brethren that the disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but only, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who bears witness of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his witness is true. What's going on there? Well, first of all, who is this beloved disciple?
John,
It's often assumed to be John. And what is his relationship to the gospel? Supposedly the author. Except, did he write this?
No.
Yeah, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and who wrote these things. So here we see evidence that there is a redactor who has come in and helped to shape the final form of this text. All right? And the question is, how much of a hand did this person or group take? Okay? Now, something else to note. What is it that Jesus says about this other disciple?
If I want him to be morally
If I want him to...
live,
Yeah, and what happens with that saying? To mean what?
that he would not die.
Okay? Why does John have to bring this up?
John is not worshipped as God or God-like.
Well, think about it. He's contradicting that Jesus actually made that claim. And that's not what he said. This is what he said. And then we know that someone else is now writing this. Because he's referring to that disciple in the third person as the one who wrote these things. What's probably happened to that disciple? He probably died. Yeah, he's probably finally died. Oh, Jesus was wrong because he said he was going to live forever. No, Jesus didn't say that. He said, if I want him to remain until I return, what is that to you? Right? So it seems to be that does that make sense? Why do you have to address that? Well, probably because the disciple has recently died. And now there are people trying to call into question what Jesus said, and so he's clarifying the record. And again, this seems to have been written by someone other than the disciple on whose testimony this gospel is based, and who it is claimed wrote these things. So there's at least one other hand at work in this gospel, putting it together. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Not much.
But that would be, that's it.
Maybe. Maybe. If you notice, if you were just reading it, it sounds just like the narration in the rest of the book. Right? Which raises the question, well, how extensive is the work of this redactor?
Just like saying that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible.
It includes his death.
Yeah, it includes his death and that he was there when God created. So, right.
Yeah. All right, so another one, and this one you should all be familiar with. After these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Right? How can you go, where is he when at the end of chapter 5?
He's on this side.
But he's in Jerusalem. How do you go from Jerusalem to the other side of the Sea of Galilee?
You go to church and hang on that.
Yeah. So chapter 1 he goes to or chapter 5 he goes to Jerusalem. At the end of the verse 18 he's still in Jerusalem. Note after chapter 18 he not only was breaking the Sabbath but also was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. If we jump straight to 7:1, after these things Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Right here. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses will not be broken, are you angry with me because I made an entire man well on the Sabbath? He's referring back to this episode. So what many scholars have suggested is the text probably originally read straight through like that. And then later, someone came in and inserted this other stuff in the middle. And that's why we suddenly get him from Jerusalem going all the way to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He wasn't on a side of the Sea of Galilee. Which means that the geographical, you can't always just take it as gospel, that he's doing all this consecutively. Some of these stories have been moved around. Yeah, I mean, you get these.
Make Dr. Trick's map.
Yes. That's why I have you do the map, so you can see some of this stuff yourself and realize how odd some of it really is.
Huge distances,
Right.
mountain ranges.
Well, what was it that we were talking early on in the semester about? He went up to,
Yeah.
which is like, wait a minute.
You always go up to Jerusalem because it's on the mountain.
That's what I was thinking. That's why I
Yeah.
noted in my thing that it had to be that way.
Whether you're going south, north, east, or west, you always go up to Jerusalem.
Hey, Dr. Tripp, I said I wasn't going to say that. I got to ask this question because if I told I come home and I still have it in my heart.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when we read all through this stuff, it was saying that Jesus would turn his water into wine. Okay, that was the first sign they said.
Yep.
And then he said the second sign, I think it was in chapter 4, when he had
Yep.
healed this person.
Right.
And then when you read through there, you'll go down there and you see some stuff that many believe, that's like 2 and 23, I believe. Many believe all because they saw all these signs. Well, wait a minute now. I'm saying you got a first sign, then it's a second sign. What are all these signs in the middle? What's all that about? I said I wasn't going to say nothing about it.
John 4:54. You keep. This is amazing. You are in tune. John 4:54. Yeah. This is again a second sign that Jesus performed when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. Well, wait a minute. 2:11. This is the beginning of his signs that he did in Cana of Galilee and manifested. So we got 1, 2, right? But what happens in between? John 2:23, exactly the verse you mentioned. Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name, observing his signs which he was doing. Well, I thought we went 1, 2. What is this many in between?
What refers back to the end, there were so many signs that were not recorded. I mean, was it just that he did other water to wine things, and they're like, yeah, we'll just mention one out of all these that he did. I mean, that's a great person to have at a wedding. You know.
Yes.
I
Yes. And note, when he came to Galilee, the Galileans received him. Why? Because they'd seen all the things he did in Jerusalem. All these signs. That's why they're receiving him in chapter 4.
Galileans going to Jerusalem with him and then back and forth.
Yeah. So yeah, there are these kind of gaps, these things that don't fit, that seem to breaks in the text. Okay? And the question then is, how do we explain these? All right, so options. 1, displacement theory. The guy finished his manuscript and was walking, and then he tripped, and the pages got shuffled, and except they didn't have pages. It would have been on a scroll, and it's kind of hard for a scroll to do that. And yeah, and then this if you read something like if you read Bultmann's commentary, he's like, these 3 words belong over here, and these 2 words belong over here, and how in the world could you know that? Right? I mean, it gets a bit ridiculous.
If he just jumping back and forth between languages and different grammar rules that left it into a scrambled mess in English?
Well, possibly. Although John is doing a lot of word plays with Greek words and things. So, a second option is an evangelist. The disciple could have produced different editions. Okay, or along with that, the redactor could have come along and edited and moved stuff around. And these last 2 do not have to be exclusive. It could be both, the evangelist doing some of this and the redactor kind of putting some finishing touches. And some of the seams are still there. Okay? So, let me quickly go through the stages of development that Ashton proposes, and we'll conclude with this. Okay? The goal is to correlate the stages of composition with the changing situation for those for whom the gospel was being written. All right? So he suggests first there was a missionary sign source, right, that tracked them out, first, second, and so forth. Then someone developed a passion source, or kind of a synoptic-esque source. All right? Then you get synagogue members with differing opinions. People sharing, talking about, what do you think about Jesus? This radical questioning then drives them to develop their faith in new ways and unexpected ways. Right? Well, if you're going to say that, then does that imply this? Oh, well, I guess it does. I hadn't thought about that. Okay, so out of these conversations, they start to develop their theology in ways that they wouldn't have anticipated, at the beginning. You then get the leaders acting as apologists and preachers, and the themes are kind of woven into a coherent whole. Ashton then suggests you get expulsion based on ditheism. In other words, claiming that Jesus is God. That's what it drove them to the realization, no, you know what? I do think he's God. Wait a minute, we're Jews. We only have one God, not 2.
It's critical for our faith to have that evolution of theory and thought continually drawn in to really establish what we believe in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's the advantage of coming to seminary.
So, but does that suggest that the Hellenization was the correct way to do it? That perhaps, those kind of Greek influences were the right way to proceed?
I don't see why this needs to be a Greek influence thing. Right? So they get expelled because they start thinking, that Jesus is God. And at that point, Ashton suggests they produce the first edition of the gospel. And what is its purpose? To convince the community they're not crazy for thinking Jesus is God. And if you notice, what does the gospel emphasize? Jesus is God. It's kind of hard to miss. Right? Brown, whom you read for this week, he actually puts it before, he says that the reason they get expelled is because they put this gospel out. That comes first. Maybe. He then suggests that there's a second edition of the gospel that reflects internal tension. Right? So in chapter 6, you get the saying about you got to eat my flesh, drink my blood, and many desert. Many leave him. All except the disciples. They say, yeah, that's kind of weird, but where are we going to go? You also get a slackening of hostility to Jews. Right? Instead of being against them, they just, we don't know what to think about this in chapter 11. Okay? And then he suggests that a redactor comes in. All right? And then the redactor, puts kind of the final touches, and we end up with the gospel that we have today. All right? Linders suggests that what did this first edition look like? Well, it probably ended with 2031, there was no chapter 21. That's why it seems like a nice conclusion to the whole thing. The farewell discourse probably ended at 1431, which is why it transitions nicely into 18:1, because 15 to 17 were added later. And there are some shifts from 14 to 15 to 17 in terms of content as well. 15 to 16 presume a ghetto community, kind of it's us against the world. Whereas, and in 14, faith, you got to believe is the big command. In 15 to 16, it changes to love one another, because it's all you got, right? So you can see kind of, you get expelled, and now we're kind of out here on our own, and so now we've got to love one another because we're all we've got. Whereas before, you're being challenged, you got to have faith, right, in the midst of the community. Chapter 6 was added later to illustrate 546, Moses wrote of me. It shows increasing internal dissension and a slackening of external hostilities. The Jews are more bewildered than antagonistic. Okay? And then chapter 10 originally followed the triumphal entry in chapter 12. The temple incident and the priest's plot. The rest of chapter 11 was added later. Once the Lazarus story was added, the temple incident was moved to the beginning of the gospel, where it now serves to introduce the key to the Johannine Jesus' riddles. Okay? And all this is based on trying to make sense of those aporias and all of that. All right? All right, we'll stop there. Pick it up next week. We'll talk about how this thing continues on into the Johannine community.